Welcome to Fortress on a Hill. I'm Henry.
I'm Danny.
I'm Kagan.
We're three leftist veterans that aim to expose the reality of the U.S. military's multiple wars abroad and to illuminate the damage military service does to Americans.
American presidents throughout U.S. history have used American military and diplomatic power to force regime change of democratically elected governments around the world.
Most veterans come from families vested in prior service, and American generals choose their own, ensuring diversity of thought never interferes with American warmongering.
How can we stand by and do nothing while our military kills and destroys lives the world over, while telling Americans that all this death and destruction protects them from terrorists when nothing could be more false?
Fortress on a Hill aims to change that.
Welcome everyone to Fortress on a Hill, a podcast about U.S. foreign policy, anti-imperialism, skepticism, and the American way of war. I'm Henry. Thank you for being with us today. With me is Kagan and Giovanni. And speaking of Giovanni, I'd like to take a moment to welcome him to the podcast as a co-host. Giovanni has a wealth of experience on U.S. imperialism and the development of the anti-war community over the last 15 years or so. So I just wanted to extend that welcome, brother. I'm glad to have you here.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for having me here. I'm glad to be here. Excited to be part of the team.
So we're here today to just talk about Ukraine and do kind of an update from our last episode where we discussed it. We're going to get into some of the recent movements of military aid being given to Ukraine, both U.S. originating and from different countries in Eastern and Central Europe. And we're also going to talk about some of those states getting more directly involved, like Poland. We're going to talk about the distinct lack of diplomacy that has been going on. And we're also going to talk about some observations we've had about the anti-war movement at this point. So, but first, let's talk about the recent aid to Ukraine. So, we know that Western governments have been pouring as many weapons into Ukraine as they can, Stinger missiles, Javelin missiles. There are countries that are providing tanks directly to Ukraine. Poland is one of them, where they're contributing, I want to say it's like 240 T-72 tanks, old Soviet tanks, and that the United States is going to reimburse them essentially with brand new Abrams tanks. It's also going to that the British are planning to send some, that and this is also alongside the fact that Finland and Sweden are making very serious moves now to become part of NATO. So this is all stuff we really need to be keeping an eye out for. Giovanni, why don't you jump in here, man?
Yeah, so just like you said about being outfitted with replace. It's interesting you say that because a lot of these this new NATO countries, right, that were part of the ex-Soviet Union, right, their military still has a lot of the old Soviet hardware, right? And one of the things about being in NATO is what they call like intercompatibility, whereas the NATO equipment has there's NATO standard equipment, like the M16 is a NATO standard equipment, the Abrams NATO and NATO standard equipment, right? So all these NATO countries, right, they're supposed to have intercompatibility with each other, right? So that means that if there's a conflict, X country can send X amount of soldiers to this country, can contribute to this amount of soldiers. X country can contribute this amount of soldiers. X country contribute this amount of soldiers, and they can bring this whole coalition and do this military action, whatever military action that they're tasked to do, whatever. Right? So, but their equipment should be intercomparable, right? They should be able to use each equipment. That's one of the things that a lot of these countries don't have. Ukraine, for example, has a lot of old Soviet Union equipment, and Ukraine also has native equipment because they also have a weapon industry on their own, which are not compatible to NATO country weaponry, right? Not compatible to the M16 and so forth and so forth and so forth, right? So in order for that to, that needs to be changed, right? That's one of the things that people like Scott Ritter and others are saying, that a lot of the weapons that are being sent to Ukraine, they can't really use it because it's not compatible to whatever they have. They don't have the maintenance technicians there to help them, to perform maintenance on these equipments and stuff like that. They don't have the training also, right? So a lot of there's articles out there that Ukrainian soldiers are going to Poland and getting like this quick down and dirty training on a howitzer, for example, how to use it, because it's not compatible to what their army is outfitted with, so it's interesting you say that, because by Poland giving out all its old Soviet equipment and weapons material, war materials, right, to Ukraine, and they're being re-outfitted with American or Western weaponry, right? That's furthering integrating Poland into Ukraine and that effect, with their military.
Yeah, the lack of training is a huge thing. There's been a lot of stuff about that the United States can pour as many weapons as it wants into it, but without the trained personnel to be able to use them, or like you said, some kind of interoperability with old Soviet stuff that they're actually trained to use, they're essentially useless. There's also the factor that the weapons being delivered from the West are mostly arriving in Western Ukraine, and that they have no real way of getting them over into Eastern Ukraine, closer to the Donbass, closer to where the fighting is actually happening. But everything takes time. Everything takes time to do this kind of training. And the truth is, for as much as the Western media wants to focus on this question of weapons, that soldiers win conflicts, not weapons, and piles of them are not going to change the calculus. We also want to bring in the factor that exactly what kind of tracking system is being done with where these weapons are going. Is there going to be anything done that's going to prevent them from leaving Ukraine and going wherever the money or the fighting happens to take it at that point? And the same with stuff that's coming from other, Eastern Bloc, former Eastern Bloc countries, is that it's a huge deluge of weapons, and eventually someone will get their hands on them to use them, whether it is legitimately the Ukrainian military fighting an invasion of Russia. I think that's a really big question mark, especially when you look at the transportation issue.
We saw how many weapons disappeared in Iraq and Afghanistan, or the fact that the forces themselves were just selling them because they needed money more than they needed a weapon that they didn't know how to use. So I don't know. It'll be interesting to see what comes of this, and how if anybody is going to end up tracking them or attempting to track them, how hard is that going to be? I think that'll be really interesting to see in the future.
Yeah, let me read this article for you. It's written by CNN on the politics. It's called "What Happens to Weapons Sent to Ukraine? The U.S. Doesn't Really Know." Right, and this was published in April 19, 2022. I'm just going to read the beginning of it. It says, the U.S. has few ways to track the substantial supply of anti-tank, anti-aircraft, and other weaponry it has sent across the border into Ukraine. Sources tell CNN a blind spot that is due in large part to the U.S. to the lack of U.S. boots on the ground in the country, and the easy probability of many of the smaller systems now pouring across the border. It's a conscious risk the Biden administration is willing to take. In the short term, the U.S. seems to transfer of hundreds of millions of dollars worth of equipment to be vital to Ukraine's ability to hold off Moscow's invasion. A senior defense official said Tuesday that it is certainly the largest recent supply to a partner country in a conflict. But the risk, both current U.S. officials and defense analysts say, is that in the long term, some of those weapons may wind up in the hands of other militaries and militia that the U.S. did not intend to arm. Here's a quote from them. We have fidelity for a short time, but when it enters the fog of war, we have almost zero, said one source brief on U.S. intelligence. It drops into a big black hole, and you have almost no sense of it at all after a short period of time. That's from the CNN. So basically, what they're telling you is that they're pouring so much weapons, so much weaponry here, right? They're just pouring just weapons left and right, left and right, left and right. I don't have a clue where these weapons are going, right? There've been reports of there's reports that as soon as they actually hit Ukraine, or actually enter, because they're coming in from places like Poland, for example. That's where they're coming in from. But as soon as they hit the country, right, a lot of them get destroyed. A lot get destroyed because Ukraine doesn't really control their airspace. Their air, defense system is kind of non-existent. So pretty much Russia has, air supremacy over Ukraine. And a lot of those weapons, when they come in, they pretty much get destroyed, a lot of these depots and whatnot. Some of them get captured. And I've seen videos of LPRs, like the militias from the Donetsk and the Lugansk, right, capturing these caches, and then they're fitting their own militias, with these weapons. So yeah. So what do you guys think about that?
It's another one of the nasty open secrets. I was just thinking while you were describing that, is that for back here on the other end, that defense contractors and stuff simply get to brag about how many weapons they've sent. There's no context given to it, no understanding of needing to go through training or that it could get destroyed en route. It is, wow, we're selling this many $billion of weapons. It doesn't matter if it's used. It doesn't matter if it gets destroyed, at least not in their calculus of things. And I would think, and I know this would be a hard hill to climb, but I would think that defense contractors should be more involved as to what happens with their weapons when they leave the factory. And I don't know how that would happen, but I think that would be a really powerful place to push some of that responsibility.
I mean, it just goes to show you that they don't care about what happens to them, because the point isn't that. The point is to make money off of the sale.
Yep.
So once that is done, they don't give a shit, because why should they? So you're right. If they actually cared about their product, like being used, then yeah, they would probably have more people on the end user side to make sure that they're getting to the people that they need. But they don't care about that, because it's not about that. It's about us making money off of selling weapons, because it's one of the few things that we manufacture in America anymore is weapons. So, they look at all of these opportunities as a big chance for them to make money, and their stock prices go up and the dividends, everything grows up, and that's all they care about.
And there could be a powerful connection there for some of the more ignorant workers in some of those weapons factories and things, to really find out, wow, my, whatever is this javelin that came across my line, it has the serial number, I worked on it, I touched it with my own hands. This javelin ended up in the hands of Azov battalion guys who end up killing a bunch more people than they would have without the weapons. I'm going to feel a lot of responsibility and regret at that, but because of how ignorant most Americans are about those things, including veterans, including people who work in defense industries, that those connections, that responsibility will probably never come to bear.
Yeah, one of the things about the defense industry, they're not really in the United States, which is, I think, is brilliant the way it's set up. The military industrial complex is that they're not really set up in a specific area. This is not, like Silicon Valley. Everybody knows Silicon Valley. That's where, all these high tech and social media, all these things comes from, right? But there's no weapon industry valley, in the United States. They're all kind of spread out throughout the whole country, and then they're, every state has, it's like the assembly lines is weird because every state has some type of involvement in the making of X weapons. Let's say a howitzer or Abrams tank or Patriot missile. So this country makes this component, and that country makes that component, and that city makes that component, and this state makes that component, and and this state assembles it, so it's kind of spread out, just like you said. There's like this compartmentalism is where the worker or the person who's there's no really is alienated from his own product, doesn't really know what's the end product going to look like. They're just working on a portion of it, and it gets shipped off somewhere else, and that's the legislators, the Congress people, right? Justify all that with bringing jobs to the country, bringing jobs to their district. That's one of the things that I heard when Bernie Sanders was initially running. I think it was in 2016, or it was before that one. It was initially running, and they were talking about the military-industrial complex, right? But he was a Vermont senator, and they were talking about, what about the factories that are in Vermont that builds these weapons and whatnot? Well, his number one job is, right, to bring jobs to his district or to his state. So naturally he's not going to vote against it. So it's kind of a way that hold people, proverbially by the balls. We can't really do much about it. These legislators can't really do much about it, because if they do try to move against it, they can say all they want, but if they try to move against it, and they say this X factory, BCE factory, or what's it, Northrop Grumman leaves their district or their state and everything, they'll be blamed for losing jobs.
It reminds me of, in a similar way, of the compartmentalization that troops have, that soldiers have between different missions. That if you're an infantryman, you understand combat from a very specific perspective. If you're in finance, if you're in intel, all these different places, but very seldom are you able to see enough pieces of the pie that a picture comes out to you without doing a significant amount of research or other stuff that way. And they should, people, we here in the Portland area, we have a huge tech community. Intel's headquarters is here. They make a great number of chips that I assume end up in military hardware. Who is willing to actually ask these questions? There was a dude we had a thing at a Portland Trailblazers game a while ago, a couple years ago, and it was like a halftime fan moment with veterans, and it was sponsored by Leopold Scopes, that makes scopes for the IDF and I'm sure many other militaries around the world, SWAT teams and police departments and stuff. And so this guy, the first two veterans, they kind of did their obligatory yes, thank you, and everything, and appreciate that. And then it got to him, and he opened his shirt, and on the shirt it was about that Leopold supplies Israeli snipers that kill children in the Palestinian territories. And I'm paraphrasing. I can't remember the exact thing that was on his shirt, but it was really powerful. But those connections are really important. I wouldn't want to make a wage that I knew was killing people somehow, somewhere, especially if it was done without any kind of significant and rigorous oversight. Let's move on to talk a little more about the neighbor states getting involved. Oh, go ahead, man. What you got?
Yeah, Henry. Yeah, before we move on about the weapons issue, right? I'm curious what Hillary Clinton has to say about it. I'm told that you've spoken with her, and she's going to tell you how she feels about this weaponry pouring into Ukraine, and what's the end goal in her mind.
I would be more than happy to share that. Hold on one second.
But remember, the Russians invaded Afghanistan back in 1980, and although no country went in, they certainly had a lot of countries supplying arms and advice, and even some advisors to those who were recruited to fight Russia. It didn't end well for the Russians. There were other unintended consequences, as we know, but the fact is that a very motivated and then funded and armed insurgency basically drove the Russians out of Afghanistan. Obviously, the similarities are not ones that you should bank on because the terrain, the development in urban areas, et cetera, is so different. But I think that is the model that people are now looking toward. And if there can be sufficient armaments that get in, and they should be able to get in along some of the borders between other nations and Ukraine, and keep the Ukrainian, both their military and their citizen volunteer soldiers supplied, that can continue to stymie Russia. Now, let's be clear that Russia has overwhelming military force. But of course they did in Afghanistan as well. They also brought a lot of air power to Syria. It took years to finally defeat Syria in terms of the insurgencies, the democratic forces, as well as others who battled the Russians, the Syrians, and the Iranians. So if you're fighting for your homeland, you're fighting for your family, you're fighting for your ideals, that's far more powerful than sending in these poor young Russian soldiers who didn't even know where they were going until they crossed the border and people were screaming at them and they realized they were in Ukraine. So I think we have to watch this carefully. We have to provide sufficient military armaments for the Ukraine military and volunteers, and we have to keep tightening the screws.
I wonder what are those unintentional consequences she was talking about.
There's been a lot of unintended consequences, and I really love the beginning of it where she was like a group of countries, just did this. The United States sent all those weapons to the Mujahideen. The United States, I mean, yes, there were a few other little partners, but by and large, it was the U.S. that chose to do that. And yeah, buckets and buckets of unintended consequences of the belief, like her reinforcing there the belief that these are Ukrainian citizens fighting for their homes, fighting for their beliefs, that they're not stuck in a quagmire between other kinds of powers and other groups of violent people. It's just a very simple thing. It's no problem. We don't got to worry about it. Let's go home, guys. I think we're done. We're good. We're good. Yeah.
The fact when she said overwhelming force from the Russians, that kind of made me upset because like 250,000 troops is not a lot when you're trying to invade a whole country.
No.
Like the last time they did this in World War II, they sent 11 million people to push the Nazis back. Like, so trying to say that they could take over a whole country with 250,000 troops has been proven that it's not possible. And so it's another way for them to be like, look how terrible they are, look how bad, which, like, I'm not saying that they're not bad because they've done some terrible things, but we always have to be wary of who is saying stuff like this and why she's saying it. And it's just, she's so clear in the way that she thinks about it, and it's really frustrating because it's again, there's no talk for diplomacy. There's no even talk about them talking about it. So that does nothing but make this thing go on further.
And to your point, right, is 200 plus troops, and also adding native troops as well, because it's something that's absent in American media, is that there's also Ukrainian militias that are fighting alongside the Russians, right? Like the LP from the Donetsk places, the LPR and the DPR people who have been fighting the Ukrainian government for the last 8 years, which is totally absent in American media. When the Russians came in, these militias are fighting alongside the Russians, and they are Ukrainian. They are ethnic Russians, but they are Ukrainian citizens. That's something absent from American media. Another point that you made is 200,000 troops facing 600,000 Ukrainian troops. So because the Ukrainians has according to people like Wilkerson, Scott Ritter and others, the Ukrainian force was roughly around 600,000, with active the militias who were integrated into the military, and also reserve components and whatnot. So when we talk about troops on the ground, the overwhelming force was the Ukrainian. They had the in numbers they were, right, the Ukrainians. However, the organizing factor, like Henry mentioned earlier, is that they're not as well organized. They weren't as well organized. There were defection, which is another thing that there's a lot of defection I think the American media has not talked about, particularly in the areas of in the areas of Russian ethnic Ukrainians who defected, particularly down in the areas of the Crimea Peninsula and whatnot. That's not mentioned. Why is it not mentioned? Because it's pretty much because if you start going into these nuances, right, it'll widen the holes in the narrative that already are there. Because if you think about it, it's been 2 months, right? You think about the narrative when it first started the conflict to how the narrative just falling apart now. Most Americans are not into this conflict. Most Americans are not. They don't feel they have a dog in the fight in this conflict. There are other pressing issues here. That people are more worried about. But yeah, that's one thing I noticed in her interview. Unintentional consequences. Of course, we all know what that means. But also, when the Russians went into Syria, they were fighting ISIS and Al Qaeda, and they were fighting alongside the Syrian National Army, but she made it sound that they were fighting Syrians. This is how the narrative, this is how the manipulation and the distortion and the misinformation. I'm told that we have a misinformation bureau now, or thing coming out now. The distortion and disinformation comes about.
No, it's yeah, I think so far the disinformation board has just been a point of laughter for most people, especially people on the left. It just is like you got. I mean, it's almost one of those moments where you're like, how more farcical could it possibly get at this time? So let's talk a little bit about the potential of neighboring states to get involved. We talked earlier about weapons being sent both by the West and by Eastern European countries, Central European countries. There's been some huge changes politically for some of these countries. Germany, that was a place that generally tried to act much more neutral than other members of NATO, has essentially reversed almost all of that. They're sending weapons, they're sending tanks, they are allowing their bases to be used to train Ukrainian troops, some by German trainers, some by American trainers, probably some other NATO trainers. And this is alongside one other really important factor is that Finland and Sweden are very close to joining NATO themselves, and they hold a huge amount of border with Russia. Of course, this is going to make Russia feel more enclosed. Granted, they don't have the same kind of political ties to Finland and Sweden that Ukraine does in the dealings with the Donbass, but it's certainly going to be very potent. And one other thing before I let you guys jump in here is that a quick reminder that there are lots and lots of countries in the world that have flat out said no. There are lots of people that have countries said that we're not doing sanctions. A lot of people saying that we're not going to send arms alongside the West. A lot of them saying that we're not going to attempt to allow you to demonize people simply to further U.S. hegemony. And so it's really important that we remember that the Western media it just forgets that so many countries, and not just countries that you would think would ostensibly side with Russia, places like China or Venezuela maybe, but lots of other ones as well. France has taken a better line on this than you would expect France to.
I wanted to bring up Belarus just because they've made it clear that they're like on the Russian side.
They have.
They, they've also been talking about invading Moldova from Transnistria, which is that little spot on the eastern border of Ukraine that's declared itself independent. Like there's Russian soldiers that are there too, but like Belarus has talked a lot about wanting to invade Moldova, which is crazy because that could escalate things further. But yeah, there's people who are it's like we're in the Cold War all over again in some sense, where because there's a proxy war and it's the US and Russia, that everything has to come down to like which side you're on, instead of the people like you were saying earlier that are saying no, like we don't want to get sucked into this stupid West versus East again, all over again, when we have much more pressing issues.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I was reading about the Transnistria, right? They're also ethnic Russians, who live there, who are part of Moldova, and they separated back in the early '90s. Actually, they declared themselves their own country in the '90s. They had like a little spat between the Moldovan military and militias there, and they've been like in a kind of Cold War since the '90s with Moldova. But what I was reading is that the Ukrainian military was pushing for Moldova to take it by force. Just like they were trying to take Donbass by force, they were trying to get the Moldovan government to take Transnistria by force, opening a second front for the Russians. However, they have a female president, prime minister. However, they so far declined. They so far declined, and they said that they will resolve their internal issues diplomatically, and politically. That's what they said, politically rather than by force. So that hasn't materialized. But yes, you're correct. At the time where it was proposed, where it was pushed for them to take that part by force, and like you say, there is a contingent of Russian forces there. There's a base there, there in Transnistria, and when it was first proposed, when it was first talked about, yes, they were talking about trying a possibility of opening another front there, and that would have the strategy would have been to kind of divide the focus of the Russians, and that would have caused more implication because the Moldovans, right, they're not Serbs, right, per se. They're not Slavs. They're morally closely, linguistically, ethnically closer to Romanians. So that would have that possibility would have got Romania also involved in the conflict if Russia were to, or Belarus were to intervene in Moldova, right, and protecting the Transnistrian people. So that probably would have, brought in also Romania into the conflict as well, would have kept widening out. Then you have Poland. Poland from the beginning, they were hinting of sending troops, peacekeeping troops. Now, West Ukraine, Poland claims West Ukraine as theirs for a long time, right? That was part of West Ukraine was Eastern Galicia at one time, which was a kingdom in the middle, in the medieval times, who the Poles say they descend from the kingdom of Galicia. So Poland is Western Galicia, and they claim that to be Eastern Galicia. So they were absorbed by the Austro-Hungary Empire, and they were part of the Austro-Hungary Empire for a while until the First World War, when the Austro-Hungary Empire were defeated. So that went part to Hungary, and then in 1919 went back to Poland. So Poland had it from 1919 until the Germans invaded Poland in the 1930s, right? So the Germans invaded Poland and they occupied that area, and they occupied Western Ukraine. That's where you guys heard about Stepan Bandera, the Banderista. There were the Ukrainians that actually collaborated with the Germans, etc. So from there they launched the invasion in the Soviet Union in 1941, and they were there to 1944 when the Soviets were actually break out and they occupied and they took that part of Ukraine and kept going forward until they got to Berlin. So what the Soviets did in 1944, they incorporated West Ukraine or Galicia to Eastern Ukraine, and that's why you got the current borders of Ukraine today. So, but they're talking about the Poles have been hinting of sending peacekeeper troops there. So they've been giving more and more hints of wanting to go into to Ukraine. So if that happens, that pretty much the country how it looks now, it seems like the country is being dismembered, right? From the east side to the south side, the east-south side, you have Crimea and everything, pretty much the areas of ethnic Russians, right? They're pretty much are being pretty much controlled by Russia right now. I heard there's a referendum they're talking about, I think in Kherson, I think the place is called, where they want to put it to a vote to reunify with Russia. So if this will happen, pretty much you got Mariupol, the Battle of Mariupol, which pretty much was pretty much taken over by Russia. So pretty much what's happening now with Ukraine is that they're losing their coast, their Black Sea coast. If that would happen, and if Poland were to take the west of Ukraine, then Ukraine pretty much would be a rump state, or pretty much would not exist anymore as we know it. Which is interesting because Zelensky, right, this person who's flying around the world like he's Pan and whatnot, right? He'll be known as pretty much the president who lost Ukraine, who lost president of Ukraine. I mean, so it's very interesting what's happening geopolitically.
And ultimately, all plays into Russia's strategy of the Balkanization of Russia, which is what they wanted to do. Like, they wanted to break it up into little pieces so it's easier for them to manipulate. And that also plays to the West as well. Even though we would like to keep them together, quote unquote, as far as what we're saying. Yeah. I mean, it's always easier to control less people when it's not unified government.
Exactly. I mean, that's what happened in Yugoslavia. It was existing more seven countries. Yeah.
Has there been any, Giovanni? Do you know if there's been any response from the U.S. government about that Western Ukraine and Poland's claim? Has anybody said anything about that in terms of the U.S.'s official position?
I haven't read anything about that, but what I'm thinking, what I'm seeing is that the fact that there's more, like for example, Russia came out and said that they will not tolerate, Polish troops in Western Ukraine. They will not tolerate Ukraine to be absorbed by Poland, right? That's one of the things that they put out. But the fact that there's been, Ukraine as an ally of NATO, United States, an allied country, etc. There's thousands of troops there. That's where they're doing a lot of the weapons and everything. But there's a lot of the fact that they're saying it openly like that, or there's some factions within Ukraine saying it openly. I haven't seen Ukraine officially say it, but the factions within it's being thrown around within the Ukrainian government, within the Ukrainian state, that they're not being reprimanded for so. They're I don't know if they're being encouraged or as part of a psyop or whatnot. They're not being reprimanded for it. I mean, they're saying it freely.
So let's move on to talk about diplomacy, or the sincere lack thereof, as far as coming from the West right now. I saw a really great interview on Rising recently that had Lieutenant Colonel Danny Davis on it, and they were discussing about whether or not that the crisis in Ukraine has already become a proxy war I would say that especially with the way that American politicians are commenting about it, different people and stuff, that it definitely is. But it was seen that way from the beginning, although it's only recently that different people have come out and actually said that they think it is. But and so talking about this lack of diplomacy, Colonel Davis said diplomacy is absolutely needed to ensure the U.S. doesn't utilize the arena of proxy wars, where both thousands of Ukrainians and Russians will die, and it will leave the door open for open, unapologetic war with Russia. So something else that Colonel Davis talked about was about that the Russian way of war is that Russia doesn't ever stop negotiating. That before a conflict, during a conflict, after a conflict, Russia will sit down at the table with people and hash things out. While the American side of things, that once a war begins, we stop negotiating. We stop communicating with our enemies for a plethora of reasons, but mostly to elongate the conflict. And that he mentioned about, it was a quote from I always say his name right, Clausewitz,
Clausewitz, yeah, Clausewitz, yeah.
That war equals politics through other means, and so that for the Russian side of things and for the the Eastern Soviet, that tradition of not stopping negotiating, that conflicts can end much quicker in that way, whereas the U.S. and especially dealing with the situation in Ukraine is saying we're just not doing it. We're just not talking to them. We're not directly talking to the Russians. We're not facilitating talks between them and Ukraine. We're not promoting other countries like France again that are willing to have some of these discussions. That it really leaves us in a bad spot, and it also is a flat out denial of what Clausewitz said. That war is a form of communication. It is political means put through the end of a bayonet, and Americans have to realize that.
I think a lot of the way Americans make war, America make war is really tied to the political system here. It's a lot of it's more domestic pageantry, because you don't want, because it's tied to the next election. A lot of these wars, right? That's one of the reasons the Afghan war was so long, the Vietnam war was so long, the Iraq war was so long, because it's always tied to the next election. And you're always looking to the next election. You don't want to be like Bush said. We don't cut out and run. We don't cut and run, right? So it's because of this domestic factor, it's very hard for the U.S. It's very hard once war starts. It's hard for them to end it because, like I said, it's tied to the next election. If you remember Lyndon B. Johnson, for example, Lyndon B. Johnson, right? He escalated the conflict in Vietnam, for example, right? Sending in more troops and everything, bombing and bombing and bombing, 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 and bombing, the whole Tonkin incident and all that, right? And the fact that the Vietnamese didn't give in, he resigned. I mean, he didn't run for the next election. He resigned, it took Nixon to pretty much end the war in Vietnam. And that's the thing, I remember when Bush went to war, when Bush, did the war in Iraq back in 2003, when he was coming up, by the time he was coming up for election, it was going badly already. It was going badly for him, right? And one of the things about his campaign was, you don't change, I forgot the way he phrased it, you don't change horse, mid-race or something like that, right?
Yeah.
Midstream.
Yeah. That's one of the phrases, so because it's tied to elections, it's very hard because the other party uses it against you. Look, you're weak, just like what happened with Afghanistan. You have Biden pretty much after 20 years, what else can you do in Afghanistan that you haven't been able to do in 20 years, So Biden finally called it quits, pulled the troops out, and it's used against him by the other party. He didn't pull troops out correctly. You should have stayed there longer, blah blah blah. We didn't complete the mission. But after 20 years, what mission are you going to complete? So 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 yeah. So because it's tied to elections, because it's part of the next election. Americans see don't really have a lot of a dog in the fight in this conflict, but they want to own the opposition. I want to own the Dems. I want to own the Republicans, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In that mindset, that's why these conflicts, continue to go so far. Whereas, like you said in Russia, right, using the Clausewitz strategy. Also, they use the Germany strategy, which is another tactician, a German tactician, I believe, where they always leave an exit strategy for the enemy. Like the way they came in Syria, the way they came in Ukraine, they always open corridors, and the strategy of opening corridors, always leaving this exit strategy for the enemy to leave, to save face and leave, is to avoid further in the the massacre, the conflicts or whatnot, this and that, right? And to actually de-escalate, because when you leave an open door for like for example in Syria, what they were doing in Syria, they were corralling the ISIS fighters, they were corralling the Al Qaeda fighters, right? But they always left the door open for them to leave. And what they were doing, they had buses there, and they were actually busing them. The fighters who gave up, who dropped the weapons and gave up, they were busing them and their family to another part of Syria, Idlib, right, which is right now it's being controlled by Turkey. So what they were doing is, right, by opening this door for the enemy to surrender, right, and to save face and leave and whatnot, this and that, right, they're de-escalating. They're de-escalating because you give the enemy the option of, I'm gonna die, I'm gonna go out in a hell of fire, or I'm going to surrender, or I'm going to desert. All three options are given to the enemy, and all three options, right, work, towards de-escalating the situation. But where you have this zero-sum mentality as, either complete victory or nothing, what you're doing is, you're just prolonging the slaughter, prolonging the conflict and so forth. You don't get nothing done, or you just do prolong the suffering. I remember when I was to work in the WINSEC, the School of the Americas, right? We used to have a lot of guest instructors from Latin America and whatnot, right? And they were embedded with us, and they were part of our team, and this and that. So I had a Colombian Special Forces guy, and he was telling me that one of the characteristics of the American military is, that they give so much high priority to force protection. Force protection, right? So in order to avoid there's this avoidance of American casualties, right, in all these wars, right? For example, if you see how the Russians enter Ukraine, or they didn't go in guns blazing and just obliterating Kiev, like like shock and awe in Baghdad, or the bombing of Belgrade in Serbia. They just bomb, bomb. They went in with troops from the get-go. And they suffered a lot of casualties coming in. But by doing that, right, they spared a lot of civilian lives too, because they didn't go and bomb the major cities, like I said, like in Baghdad and so forth, right? Whereas Americans, they were going bombing major cities, just carpet bombing, right, to avoid American casualties. That's the difference in war making. That's what the Colombian Special Forces guy was telling me, is that American soldiers, the American way of fighting is it puts so much emphasis on force protection that they to avoid casualties, in their conflict. And I think that's part of the Vietnam syndrome, to be honest, where there, so much casualty, occurred in Vietnam, where the American public, kind of developed this resistance to the next conflict, So as long as they're, so when you start seeing American conflicts, then you start getting resistance from the American public. But as long as there are very little, none American conflict, then, this kind of out of sight, out of mind. I think that's the strategy behind it.
Yeah, to me, it's a point of cowardice that Bush, when he came in and stopped letting coffins be shown on CNN or MSNBC, what have you, coming in, that that the our addiction to war has already been set back so many ways, into the periphery of Americans' vision, and by doing that, can't even acknowledge that there are Americans dying somewhere for some reason. They may have no concept of what the conflict is, but even Bush said we're going to take that away. But it also can go back to that there was a very strong response from both the DoD and American media following the Vietnam War to change the way that they covered wars. That, like, Walter Cronkite had that thing for I don't know how many years he did it, but every night when he closed his show, it was in the 60s and 70s, that this is how many troops have died in Vietnam. And so that the ordinary person watching the news tonight, even if he didn't do a story on Vietnam, reminded him that there are Americans somewhere dying, and we have some vested interest in this. But we've so moved away from that. And Giovanni, what you're mentioning about force protection is that it also reminds me of the pedestal that America places soldiers on. That we at some point, some of the myths for American soldiers have to be true. And when a soldier dies, I won't say like that the families get a lot or anything, but that our culture responds very, very strongly to that. We don't respond nearly as strongly for the people we killed. We don't respond for the other militaries. That Colombian Special Forces guy you mentioned, working alongside them. If something happened to him in the course of American military training, we wouldn't have a second thought. But soldiers, oh man, they're the golden ticket. They're the thing that we have to hang on to. And it can just get attributed back to propaganda and PR.
We get asked often what people can do to help support the podcast. One very powerful way is to help us grow and reach more people is to leave us a review. You can do that on iTunes, which is the best place to leave a review. iTunes does reach the most people these days. The next best place is Facebook. Go to our Fortress on a Hill Facebook page and look for the reviews tab. And finally, there's Patreon, where we're blessed to have an array of wonderful supporters helping us for some of the podcast's expenses. Those who contribute $10 or more a month will be mentioned here as an honorary producer, helping keep you, our listeners, stocked with new episodes. But you don't have to contribute $10 a month to help us. For as little as $1 a month, you can help us keep going, paying for hosting and storage fees, transcribing old and new episodes, promoting and expanding the podcast, and more I'm sure I can't think of at the moment. So let's bring out these honorary producers, and they are Fahim Shirazi, James O'Barr, Adam Bellows, Eric Phillips, Paul Appel, Julie Dupree, Thomas Benson, Janet Hansen, Tristan Oliver, Daniel Fleming, Michael Caron, Zach H., Ren Jacob, Howard Reynolds. Why I Am Anti-War Podcast, Korgoth, Rick Coffey, and the Status Quo Podcast. You are all the engine that helps us power the podcast. Thank you so much. However, if Patreon isn't your style, you can contribute directly to us through PayPal at paypal.me/fortressonahill. Or please check out our store on Spreadshirt for some great Fortress merch. There's t-shirts, mugs, phone cases, and a whole lot more. And now let's get back to the podcast.
Yeah, it's definitely the story, like you say, like when American soldiers die, there is a story behind it. Like, who was this person?
Mm-hmm.
How did they live their life? All this stuff. But the other people are just numbers.
Mm-hmm.
Like we don't go into the in-depth story of some random kid who's getting blown up in Syria or Yemen right now. Nobody talks about that. It's just it's a statistic to them, to everyone, because we don't want to actually turn the lens on ourselves and think about the way that we're doing war, because the media companies are owned by the same people that own the defense contracting companies, and they have so much to lose if they started to be adversarial, that they would rather just get along. It's why, so many media organizations don't push presidents or the press secretary to ask adversarial questions, because they want that access. Like, that access matters more to them than telling the truth. And that's the sick system that we live in, where the media and our government are in like lockstep because they want the access to the people. And it makes me so frustrated that there isn't, like, that's why the left is gone. Like, that's why there's no anti-war sentiment in America as much, because we're not telling those stories.
And it's the thing that makes proxy wars doubly dangerous for the United States, because that one thing that people might have been paying attention to see soldiers coming home in coffins is not really a factor anymore. A proxy war is going to entirely involve forces that if we're giving them anything, we're giving them weapons and money, but we're not giving them American lives. And so where that would come out and spill out, where people would get to see it, it's gone. It's not even a possibility anymore.
Yeah, so on that, I remember when the war against Yugoslavia, for example, Clinton, that was the whole concept of air war, air war, air power, air war, and Serbia fell and they lost. Yugoslavia fell, Serbia fell, they lost Kosovo, which Kosovo was a province of Serbia. And remember the Clinton administration talking about, we won this, we had this victory just on air power alone, without losing an American soldier, American troop, just air power alone, we got this great victory, But that wasn't true. That wasn't true, because there were boots on the ground, right? But the boots on the ground, they were from the KLA, which is the Kosovo Liberation Army. So they were the one that were doing the fighting on the ground, And the interesting about the KLA is that the KLA before the war, against Serbia, they were designated a terrorist organization, right? By the United States. And then when the war started, they were removed from the terrorist list, and then they were given support now, they were given weapons and support, and even Al Qaeda was said to be there as well on the ground as well, fighting the Serbians. But we just provided the air power, So someone's going to die. Someone's going to die, right? Like you said, it was a proxy war, right? The troops that died in that conflict were KLA fighters and Serbian fighters, But you can't say like Clinton said, we won, this war was a victory because there was no casualties. That's not true,
It's just like when people want to say that this situation in Ukraine is the first time that war has come to Europe since World War II. And we know that this isn't true. We know that there's all kinds of conflicts still going on. Certainly what's happening in Syria, what's happening in Ukraine. But they count on our apathy. They count on us not wanting to worry about Yemeni deaths in their air war there, not worry about Iraqi civilian deaths in the war against ISIS. Just to let them all fall into the background. Or if they do grab onto something, it's something incredibly specific and usually misconstrued, like what happened in Bucha. That, yes, it's clear that some people got hurt, but talking about it like it's genocide, like anything that has happened in this war thus far is risen to the level of even using the word genocide. And yet that's the connection that they want people to make. They want them to grab onto, the right victims, the right and support the right people. But yeah, with no troops in there, there's no meat in the game, and Americans really have to ask hard questions about that.
So Henry, so what's the deal with the whole weapon, going back to the weapons, the aid package, the military aid package going to Ukraine? What do you guys know about that? I mean, it just happened recently right now, right? Called for $33 billion, right?
He did, and they jumped him. They're like, sorry, Mr. President, it's got to be 40. We have to do at least $1 billion over 7. Let's do it. Sounds great, yeah.
And what's crazy is this conflict has only been, so there's this Glenwell article, right? He says, Greenwell, Biden wanted 33 billion for Ukraine. Congress quickly raised it to 40 billion. Who benefits, right? And then he breaks it down here from month to month. So he says on February 26th, Biden approved 350 million in military aid for Ukraine. In March 6th, Biden announced 8 million in military aid for Ukraine. March 30, Ukraine to receive additional 500 million in aid from U.S. Biden announces. April 12th, U.S. to announce 750 million more in weapons for Ukraine. May 6th, Biden announces new 150 million weapons package for Ukraine, which all this amounts to about 3 billion in weapons. And in about in like the first month or so of the conflict, we're into 2 months now. With this, there's they're up to 40 more billion. So they're like up to like 53 billion, aren't they?
Something like that, yeah.
In about 2 months
altogether.
And you know that the Russian budget, the Russian military budget, it's less than $70 billion a year. Less than 70 billion. However, in 2 months, the Ukrainians have been given 50 billion, in 2 months. Lots to chew on there.
Yeah, even in military to military comparison, it's just insane. And of course, we often hear about that money could go to much better things. Help with the college debt relief and Medicare for all and things that could actually end up helping Americans. But part of this,
we could end homelessness with $2 billion.
Yeah,
but we'd rather give money to defense contractors. $2 billion. That's it. Like, to end homelessness in America, and we can't even do that.
So do we ever? So what happened to the Build Back Better? Did it ever get approved?
No, it died. They died because Manchin and Sinema didn't want to do it, and they are all about like breaking it up and making it smaller, different legislation things. But it's he's getting so much. They both are getting so much money for stopping it, for being this obstruction block in the middle of it. They are getting so much money from Republican groups to do this, and they just don't care because they're getting paid.
Yet in 2 days, you can get $50 billion approved or $40 billion approved in 2 days. Bipartisan.
Right. Meanwhile, gas is like $6 a gallon in some places, and people are struggling with food costs.
We're getting to the point now where we're at George W. Bush administration levels of gas prices again, and it's probably actually going to lap that. It's actually going to go past it, and nobody cares. It's not an issue. It's not a question for anybody. All right. Close us out today. We're going to talk a little bit about the state of the American anti-war community. A couple things to mention first. Of course, this follows the huge purging of independent outlets that have happened since the situation in Ukraine began, the shutdown of RT America, and a whole host of American journalists on there. I have a quote here from Chris Hedges on about whether or not anyone would actually believe that they were disseminating Russian propaganda, and he said, "They know it's not Russian propaganda. We rarely mention Russia or Putin, and the few times we did it was not in flattering terms. It's much more pernicious than that." RT gave a platform to a critic such as myself. It was a show that gave a voice to critics of the United States ruling class and the U.S. empire. They knew I was not disseminating Russian propaganda unless critiquing the ills of American society serves Russia's interest. I guess to an extent that it might. That's, of course, why RT gave me a show. But in a functioning democracy with a free press, that is the precise role of the press. And then much more recently, we have a few independent outlets like Consortium News and Mint Press News being banned from utilizing PayPal for their payments, to having huge accounts of their contributors, that people that contribute to those outlets, having it being frozen and not certain exactly when they will get it back. They're not given any reason for the eviction beyond a vague violation of PayPal's rules. I know, Giovanni, I know you messaged us about that, and of course that it is entirely possible that this could affect Fortress on a Hill in some way. I hope that it doesn't, but if it does, I won't be surprised, because we are certainly not about the mainstream talking points here. What do you guys think? Please jump in here.
I think it just makes me sad that like there is no room for anything other than supporting the Ukrainian military. And I was listening to Deconstructed a while back where Ryan Grimm was on there, and he was talking about how like being in the press corps, and he was the only person who asked a question about diplomacy. Everyone else was talking about MiGs or talking about, when are we going to send them money, or when are we going to send them weapons? Like this was the beginning stages. And like he was literally the only person who had any question that dealt with diplomacy at all. And the response was equally bad, because they basically just said, we're doing a whole bunch of humanitarian efforts along with these aid packages to like, it's like saying that sending weapons and doing all this stuff is somehow diplomacy. And it just it makes me sad that like there's like no room in the mainstream media for anyone to even ask like serious questions of the administration.
I mean, you talked about it earlier, Henry, about the during the Vietnam War, the narratives, how media behaved then and how media behaves now. And that's one of the things that happened in the Vietnam War. Is Vietnam War was the first televised war for, where Americans actually were able to see in real time what was happening on the ground. And that horrified a lot of people, and that pretty much moved the mood, changed the mood of the American public, and turned it against the war. And that's why you have so much resistance to the war in Vietnam, and the anti-war movement grew so large, and they pretty much pushed to the end, for the war to end and so forth, and that's part of the reason why, because of the images that these media outlets were projecting to the American people. Right after that, the media, with the Gulf War, the first Gulf War, the one in '91, that was fast forward, that was another conflict where the media was given access, because before, through from the Vietnam War, to '91, to '90, right, the most of the wars that the United States were involved were shadow wars, were dirty wars, and they were really troops, in the front lines, and whatnot, But for the first Gulf War, with the exception of Grenada and Panama, but the first Gulf War was the first major war since Vietnam, where they actually have, armor, and they actually have, troops in the front line, and whatnot. It lasted about 100 hours. It lasted and everything, so they didn't give the media time to critique it. At first they were cheerleading and everything, but since the Vietnam War to today, the media has tamed, and they pretty much resorted to just propagating the talking points, the State Departments, the Pentagons, whichever general's talking points, and not resist, not say anything different. And there's people that have been fired for, just like you were saying, Kagan, about the person asking about diplomacy. There have been incidents, like, for example, in 2002, 2003, there have been journalists that have been fired, like Chris Hedges was one of them. He was fired from because he had a different narrative of the war in Iraq. Phil Donahue was another journalist that lost his show because he was resisting the war narrative, against Iraq and everything. But with the what do you call it, the alternative media, like Fortress on the Hill and everything coming out. In part because of the war in Iraq, in part because of that, that's why we have this alternative media. We have this ecosystem now of alternative media. You see a lot of people turning turning away from legacy media, particularly younger people, and they get most of their media from alternative media, mainstream media, not social media, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That media is not easily controlled as the legacy media is. That media is not easily, the narrative is not controlled like legacy media. So now, because it's not controlled, now they're resorting to what's happening now. Pretty much deplatforming people, demonetizing people, closing their PayPal accounts, et cetera, to silence that alternative narrative. If you look at other alternative media, like, I'm not going to say names here, but that pushes the talking points. If you look at likes, if you look at down at YouTube or whatever, how many views they got, they can get like thousands of views, But if you get other alternative media that has a counterpoint to it, they might have hundreds of views, 1,000 views and stuff like that, So now you have the algorithm that is playing, who gets to see, who get to be seen, who get to be seen. I'll guarantee you that if I shoot videos of cute kittens and dogs and everything, I'll probably get more views on YouTube than this episode, because of the way the algorithm works and everything, they're putting people up front. But it's not new. I mean, this is not new either. I was going back to Wilson, when the First World War kicked off, Wilson didn't start sending troops until 1917. That's when he passed the Espionage Act and everything. It was criminalized to critique the war effort. It was criminalized to talk against the troops. It was criminalized to talk against the war that's supposed to end all wars. It was supposed to be the war, to defend democracy. What is it? What was his catchphrase? The war for democracy and whatnot. People went to jail. A famous person, Eugene Debs, he went to jail. People who, he ran. He ran for president from jail. He criticized the American entry in the First World War. You've seen people that were prominent people that got deported. They got deported because they spoke out against the war and whatnot. So yes, it's not nothing new. It's pretty much when the state is not able to control the narrative. Like we saw in Vietnam, like we see now with the monetizing the platform, like we saw back in 1917. That's their reaction. The reaction is to criminalize dissent.
And that's something that we're probably gonna see change and get worse as we get older. As just that they, there's so many people, that they attach to so many different people through propaganda, and you're not standing with this country there because they're being victimized. You're not standing with your countrymen who are sending arms to Ukraine. You're don't have, and like Chris Hedges' case, don't have a narrative that would be welcoming to what the national security state is already doing or wants to do in the near future. There were people talking with surprise about how was it that Biden knew when the Ukraine and Russia stuff was supposed to kick off, and it was because it was connected to a Ukrainian offensive fighting and killing Russian speakers in the Donbass, and that was a big aspect of it. But that if your media did not connect you to that point, there was absolutely no way that you were going to know that was the reality that we were dealing with. And so, folks, as we're wrapping up here and just talking about this, that it's going to get worse. It may even become more pernicious, as Chris Hedges mentioned. And so please, as much as you can, as much as you're willing to be out in, the Twitter space and on Facebook and stuff, talking to people, that, please get those opinions out there. Please share those articles, share our episodes, others episodes that are talking about this kind of stuff, all of it. do whatever you can to try to bring those opinions to other people, and hopefully people that are open to hearing them, because a lot of people you run into will not be. Hopefully the people that are open to hearing them will sit and listen to you, and that it won't automatically become that you're a Putin puppet, that you're someone that is just you have a Russia friendly talking points, or however they want to demonize that. But yeah, it's about we have to talk to people that don't agree with us, and that is how we make headway in doing any of this stuff. So, final thoughts, guys? Anything you'd like to throw out there before we wrap up for today?
I mean, just something that we like to stress here, be skeptical. Like, being skeptical first is always important when you're dealing with the forces that we have here in our country that want us to believe certain things about what America is and what it stands for. And I think that, we always just have to be critical of that, of like why people want to push us into war whenever military action is undertaken. Like, it's not something out of the blue. It's a concerted effort on people that want to continue to have us be the hegemonic, the only superpower in America. Even though that is changing, there's a lot of people that still believe that that's the way that it should be. And I don't know. I mean, we have to be aware of that. We have to think about it and question it and be willing to talk to people that we may not agree with on everything, but if we can agree on this thing, that is what's really going to grow any kind of resistance movement against the wars, is when we have people that are 70% we align with them. We need them on our side, because if we're just going to be purists and ideological purists about stuff, we're never actually going to get the consensus that we need to actually have enough people to push back against this narrative. So just be aware.
Yeah, I'll say I add that to what Keegan said. Be skeptical, but I'll caution people. Yes, be skeptical, but not be cynical, which is something that can happen as well. When you become cynical, then you become apathetic, and not care. Avoid being cynical. You think about this conflict. You can you think about $50 billion going to Ukraine in 2 months. How are you going to benefit? In what way do you benefit from that? In what way does Ukraine benefit from that? Just helping prolong the suffering, prolong the deaths, and the destruction. Where so easily this war can stop today if people come to the table, and if this government, this Zelensky's government, right, is allowed to negotiate. Is one way. But think about it. Don't be cynical. Be critical. Be skeptic, but do not be cynical, because it does affect you. Because when you start seeing, right now, we were talking about before we started about Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka is pretty much the first government that has fallen because of this conflict. Because of the crisis in Ukraine has rippled into Sri Lanka, so their government fell recently. We've seen companies in Germany, for example, companies, talking about that they're about to file bankruptcy because of the sanctions imposed on Russia and stuff like that. So yeah, think about it. It does affect you. Don't think about it because it's thousand miles away. I know that they're playing into our compassions, but we're not benefiting from this. They're not benefiting. The Ukrainian people are not benefiting from this. The Russian people are not benefiting from this. No one's benefiting from this. People in Africa are not benefiting from this. So who's benefiting from this? Who's this money going to go to exactly? Not you and me. It's going to go to other people. Other people that are banking on this. Think about this. Think about that. Yes, I know that one of the things about our system is to make us feel powerless, and they keep telling us to, that if you're unsatisfied, just vote. And if things doesn't come the way, if things still haven't worked out, vote harder, and it still haven't worked out, vote even harder, but they're not giving us, just like the image that you showed us, they're not giving us an option, either this or that. We got to think ways to resist. We got to think other ways to resist, other ways to be heard, other ways to get our demands out, and take control of this state apparatus, that we call the national security state.
It's a really good point, brother. That the cynicism can really creep in on you, and we have to believe that there's a better way, and that that we're making a difference. That we're getting out there and actually that things. Not that we all have the power to change it, but that things can change, that things can get better for people. And we're not the only ones. Like I mentioned earlier about the huge number of nations in the world that have said, we're not going along with this. We're not going to add to the bloodshed by signing our names onto a line that says we're okay with whatever happens there, because we're not okay with it. And that's regardless of who happens to have the most power at the moment. Russian, American, Ukrainian, NATO nations, it doesn't make a difference. That everybody should get put under the microscope of the things that we're talking about right here. Well, I think that's a good place for us to wrap it up for today. Thank you guys both for coming to chat with me and talking about what's happening in Ukraine and some of our impressions of it. We will be back again soon. I don't know what we have on the board right now, but keep an eye on our Twitter or Facebook. We'll let you guys know where we're headed, and we hope you take care.
Take care. Keep fighting. Stay strong.
We're on Twitter at Fortress on a Hill, and also at facebook.com at Fortress on a Hill. You can find our main blog page and our full collection of episodes at www.fortressonahill.com. iTunes, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, Patreon, Spotify. You name it, almost anywhere you listen, we're already waiting for you. And hey, we're always in the market for more Patreon supporters. Please consider becoming a patron at patreon.com. And if you're not into giving us a monthly payment, think about giving us a couple bucks on PayPal. The link is in the show notes. Skepticism is one's best armor. Never forget it. We'll see you next time.
And listen to my song. I hope you'll pay attention. I will not